Cast out with nothing but $3 to her name, a desperate young orphan was forced to buy a rotting, abandoned shack on the edge of town just to survive. The locals thought she was a fool for moving into a haunted ruin, completely unaware that this desolate wasteland secretly harbored a staggering hidden fortune. And they never suspected it concealed the exact weapon she needed to crush a ruthless millionaire's conspiracy, expose a massive crime ring, and claim a breathtaking legacy that would change the town forever. Settle in with us for this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We're glad to have you here. Alice Whittaker's life had been shaped by things ending. Her father, a man with kind eyes and hands, skilled at carving small, intricate animals from scraps of wood, had gone to war when she was 5 and never returned. He left behind a wife who seemed to shrink with grief and a small palm-sized sun gourd he had carved from a piece of maple, its wings half spread as if caught in a moment of decision. That bird was the only thing Alice had left of him. Her mother, hollowed out by loss and the harshness of a world without him, succumbed to consumption 3 years later, leaving Alice an orphan. At 8 years old, she was taken in by a neighboring family, not out of charity, but for the utility of an extra pair of hands. She learned to work without complaint, to make herself small and useful, a quiet shadow in other people's lives. When that family moved west to the Dakota Territory, she went with them, an unspoken part of their luggage. They settled her as a domestic at Gable's boarding house in the raw new town of Redemption, and there she stayed for 7 years. Her mentor, if such a formal word could be applied to such a quiet relationship, was Mrs. Gable, a woman of sturdy build and even steadier temperament. She saw an Alice not a servant, but a reflection of her own younger self, competent, observant, and possessed of a deep, untapped well of resilience. It was Mrs. Gable who taught her more than just how to properly bleach linens or bake a presentable loaf of bread. She taught Alice how to manage accounts, how to order supplies with an eye for economy, how to mend a torn shirt, so the stitches were nearly invisible, and most importantly, how to listen to the rhythms of a house and the unspoken needs of the people within it. "A well-run house is a quiet house, Alice," she would say, her hands busy with darning. "Trouble makes noise. Peace is silent." Under Mrs. Gable's patient tutelage, Alice blossomed from a timid girl into a young woman of profound capability. She ran the day-to-day operations of the boarding house with an efficiency that made her indispensable. For a time, she felt she had found a place, a purpose, but things in Alice's life had a habit of ending. Mrs. Gable passed from a sudden fever in the winter of '87, and the quiet peace of the house died with her. The ejection, when it came, was not a dramatic confrontation. It was in its own way worse. It was a quiet administrative cruelty that erased her 7 years of service as if they had never happened. Mr. Gable, a man lost without his wife's steadying hand, had decided to remarry. His new bride, a woman from a more established eastern city, had her own ideas about how a proper home should be run. And those ideas did not include a young woman who knew the house's secrets better than she did. A week after the wedding, Mr. Gable called Alice into the front parlor, the one Mrs. Gable had always kept smelling of lemon oil and dried lavender. He stood by the window, refusing to meet her eyes, his hands clasped behind his back. "Alice," he began, his voice thick with a discomfort that was entirely his own. "Mrs. Gable, the new Mrs. Gable, feels it is best to make a fresh start with her own people. He cleared his throat. She has a cousin arriving who will be taking over the household management. Alice stood perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her. She did not plead or argue. She had learned long ago that begging only amplified another's power. She simply nodded, a small spare movement of her head. "I understand," she said, and her voice was as calm and steady as the one Mrs. Gable had taught her to use when dealing with a difficult boarder. He pressed 5 folded dollar bills into her hand. "For your service," he mumbled, finally glancing at her face before looking quickly away again, as if shamed by her composure. She was to be out by the end of the week. She went upstairs to her small attic room and began to pack. She folded her 2 spare dresses and a set of work sea clothes into the small wooden trunk. On top, she placed the worn copy of a book Mrs. Gable had given her, and beside it she carefully laid the carved maple songbird, its smooth, worn surface, a small, solid piece of love in a world that had grown cold and brittle. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury she had never been able to afford. She simply gathered what remained of her life and prepared to move. Her journey was not one of miles, but of social distance, a walk of a few hundred yards that felt like crossing a continent. Carrying her trunk, she left the boarding house, the place that had been her entire world, and stepped into the dusty main street of redemption. The town, which had once felt like a community, now seemed alien and hostile. Faces that had greeted her with familiar nods now looked at her with curiosity, their eyes lingering on the trunk that marked her as transient, unmed. She felt their gazes like a physical weight. She paid Mr. Gable the $1.50 she owed for her final days of board, a point of pride she would not surrender. Her fortune was now $357. She had nowhere to go. That afternoon, the town was holding a public auction for properties with delinquent taxes, a periodic clearing of the books. It was held in the open square, the auctioneer standing on the back of a wagon. Alice stood at the edge of the small crowd, a ghost in a calico dress, simply because she had nowhere else to be. They sold off a failed smithy, a parcel of useless screwland, and a miner's claim that had never yielded an ounce of color. Then the auctioneer called out the last lot, number 7, the old Telegraph office. Building and contents, back taxes owed, are $3. A low murmur went through the crowd. Men shifted their weight and looked away. "That's Elias Vance's place," someone muttered. "The one who ran." The story was common knowledge. Vance, the telegraph operator, had disappeared one night 6 months prior, leaving behind a half-eaten meal and a cold coffee pot. Some said he'd absconded with company funds. Others whispered he'd gotten into trouble with the wrong people. The office had been silent ever since, a monument to failure and fear at the railway edge of town. $3 is the ask, the auctioneer repeated, his voice straining. "Do I hear 3? Silence. The wind kicked up dust around his boots. No one wanted a place with that kind of history. No one wanted the bad luck that seemed to cling to its peeling paint. In that moment, a quiet, fierce resolve took hold of Alice. It was an act born not of hope, but of its absence. She had $3. The property cost $3. It was a roof. It was a door she could lock. It was hers. Before she could lose her nerve, she raised her hand. $3, she said, her voice clear and steady. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. All eyes turned to her. The auctioneer blinked, startled. $3 from the young lady. Do I hear $4? $350. The silence returned thick and absolute. No one would bid against her for the haunted shack. Sold. The auctioneer cried, slamming his gavel down on the wagon bed with a crack that made her flinch. To the lady for $3. She walked forward, counted out the coins into his hand, and received a slip of paper that declared her the owner of Lot 7. She had just spent everything she had on a place everyone else was afraid to touch. She acquired the key from the town clerk, a rusty piece of iron that felt heavy with neglect. The telegraph office stood isolated at the far end of the street, where the town frayed into open prairie beside the gleaming steel of the railroad tracks. It was a small square building of clapboard siding, its paint weathered to a pale, ghostly grey. The sign above the door, once a proud black on white, was now a faded muddle of letters. Dakota Territory, Telegraph, and Dispatch. The porch sagged on one end, and a window on the side was shattered. A dark, gaping mouth. It looked less like a building, and more like something the prairie was slowly consuming. Alice inserted the key into the lock. It resisted, grating with rust, but with a firm turn, the mechanism gave way with a heavy clunk. The door swung inward on a single groaning hinge, opening into a cloud of dust motes, dancing in the single shaft of afternoon light. The air inside was thick and stale, smelling of abandonment, dry rot, and the faint, sharp scent of ozone, a ghost of the electricity that had once pulsed through the wires. The main room was small, perhaps 12 feet square. A thick layer of dust covered everything, softening the sharp edges of disaster. A simple wooden chair was overturned on the floor. Papers were scattered across the floorboards, rustling faintly in the draught from the broken window. Against the back wall stood the operator's station, a heavy wooden desk, and on it the heart of the dead office. The telegraph key, its brass lever dulled with a greenish tarnish, sat beside a sounder, a silent electromagnet. A row of heavy glass jars containing spent battery fluid lined a shelf above the desk, their zinc and copper elements corroded and useless. Alice ran a finger over the smooth, cool surface of the key. It was a tool of connection, a voice that could speak across hundreds of miles, now silenced. To the right of the main room, a doorway led to a smaller space, barely large enough for a cot and a small wood stove. This must have been where Elias Vance lived. A thin, lumpy mattress was thrown on a simple frame. A single grey blanket crumpled on top. A tin coffee pot sat on the cold stove. It was a lonely, Spartan existence. She spent the rest of the daylight hours in a fury of cleaning. She found a broom with worn bristles and swept 6 months of dust, dirt, and mouse droppings out the door. She righted the chair. She gathered the scattered papers, old tariffs, shipping manifests, blank message forms, and stacked them neatly on the desk. As evening fell, the temperature dropped. The wind moaned through the broken window pane. Alice used a piece of loose board to cover the hole as best she could, but the cold still seeped. She had no wood for the stove, no food, no lamp oil. She took the single blanket from the cot, shook it out vigorously on the porch, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She sat on the edge of the cot in the deepening dark, her small trunk at her feet. The silence of the prairie pressed in, a vast and indifferent presence. She reached into her trunk and took out the small carved bird. She held it in her palm, its familiar weight, a small anchor in the overwhelming emptiness. She had a roof. She had 4 walls. It was a ruin, but it was her ruin. And for the first time since she had left the boarding house, she felt not fear, but the faintest glimmer of something else, the stubborn, quiet pride of ownership. The next morning, Alice began the slow, methodical work of turning the derelict office into a home. Her first priority was survival. She used the 7 cents she had left to buy a small handful of nails from the general store, and with those and some salvaged planks from a collapsed fence behind the building, she patched the broken window and secured the sagging porch step. She spent the day gathering fallen branches and dry brush from the creek bed a 4 mile away, stacking it neatly beside the stove. That evening, for the first time, a thin ribbon of smoke rose from the telegraph office's chimney. She had no food, but she had warmth. The next day, she walked to the mercantile and spoke to the owner, Miss Henderson. She did not ask for credit or charity. She offered to work. "I can mend, sir," she said, her voice even, "and I can clean." He looked her over, his gaze assessing. He knew who she was, knew she'd bought the Vance place. He saw the determination in her face, the absence of self-pity. He gave her a pile of dusty flour sacks to wash and mend. She took them back to the creek, scrubbed them clean with sand and water, and sat on her porch, stitching the holes with thread. She'd carefully unraveled from a discarded piece of canvas. By the end of the day, the sacks were clean, strong, and neatly folded. She returned them to Mr. Henderson, who inspected her work and gave her a bag of flour and a small slab of salt pork in payment. It was the first food she had earned for herself, and the simple meal she cooked on the small stove that night was the best she had ever tasted. A week passed in this manner. She worked, she repaired, she survived. The office slowly transformed under her care. One afternoon, while sweeping the floor near the operator's desk for the 10th time, her broom caught on something. A floorboard just to the right of where the operator's feet would have rested, lifted slightly. It was not rotten like some of the others. It felt different. Kneeling, she examined it closely. She saw a thin, precise cut along its edge, nearly invisible beneath the grime. It had been deliberately sawn through and set back in place. Her heart began to beat a little faster. Using the flattened end of a metal rod from one of the dead battery jars as a makeshift pry bar, she carefully worked it into the seam and lifted. The board came up with a soft groan of old wood. Beneath it was a small, dark cavity, and nestled inside was a metal tin box, the kind used for holding deeds or cash. Beside it lay a leather-bound ledger. With trembling hands, Alice lifted the box out. It was heavy. She unlatched it. Inside, neatly bundled and tied with string, was a stack of United States bank notes. She counted it slowly, her fingers stiff with disbelief. 200 Aldern, a fortune. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. Setting the money aside, her mind reeling, she picked up the ledger. Its pages were filled with neat columns of what looked like gibberish, strings of letters and numbers. It was a code. Tucked inside the front cover of the ledger was a sealed envelope. On it, in a precise, elegant script, was written to whoever finds this. She broke the seal. The letter inside was dated the day before Elias Vance had disappeared. It read, "If you are reading this, it means I did not make it away safely, and my fears were founded. My name is Elias Vance. I was the telegraph operator in this office for 2 years. I am not a thief. I have not run from a debt. I have run for my life. For months, I have suspected that a second private telegraph line was being used by certain powerful men in this town to intercept land survey information from the capital before it was made public. They have been using this intelligence to file claims on the most valuable parcels of land, cheating honest settlers out of their chance. The man at the center of this is Mr. Silas Croft, the president of the Redemption Bank. I discovered the hidden tap line connected to my main relay. I have been recording his coded transmissions in this ledger while sending my own coded reports to Federal Marshal Thomas Albright in Bismarck. I believe they know I am on to them. I must leave tonight. The money in this box is my life savings. It is not much, but I leave it for you as a stake. I do not know who you are, but I pray you are a person of integrity." The code for the ledger is a simple one, based on a book of verse I have left on the shelf. The key is the page number, line number, and word number. Joseph Hask, the freight hauler, is a good man. He has been helping me, carrying my duplicate reports by hand. He can be trusted. Do not let this injustice stand. Do not let them get away with it. Yours in hope, Elias Vance. Alice sat back on her heels, the letter shaking in her hand. The silent, dusty office was suddenly filled with the voice of a brave, desperate man. She was no longer just a cast-off girl in an abandoned shack. She was the inheritor of a dangerous secret. The discovery of the cash changed everything. The 200 was not just money. It was freedom. It was the means to stop living hour to hour and begin to build. But the letter and the ledger were a heavier burden. They were a call to action, a moral inheritance from a man she had never met. Alice hid the money and the ledger back beneath the floorboard, her mind a whirlwind of fear and resolve. For now, she would focus on what was tangible, what she could control. She would make this place secure. The next day, she walked to the lumber yard. The crisp banknotes folded carefully in her pocket. She bought new shingles for the roof, a pane of glass for the broken window, and milled boards to repair the flooring and the porch. She worked with a focused intensity that left no room for doubt. She learned how to patch a roof by watching the carpenters in town, her observant nature once again her greatest tool. She spent 2 days on a ladder, methodically nailing down each shingle, her arms and back aching, but her spirits soaring with every hammer blow that made her home safer, more her own. One evening, as she was mixing a small batch of mortar to set the new window pane, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see a tall, broad-shouldered man standing there. His face was weathered, his eyes a guarded, weary blue. He wore the sturdy clothes of a freight hauler. "That's a lot of work for a place like this," he said. His voice was a low rumble. Alice's hand stilled. "It's my place," she replied simply, not inviting further conversation. He nodded slowly, his gaze taking in the new shingles, the stack of lumber. The last man who lived here, Elias Vance. He came to a bad end. He paused, watching her reaction. This office has a history. Some things are best left buried. Alice met his gaze directly. Some things need to be brought into the light. A flicker of something. Surprise. Respect. Crossed his face before the guarded mask fell back into place. "Your business," he said with a shrug, and turned to leave. "My name is Joseph Hasker," he added over his shoulder. And then he was gone. The name echoed in her ears. Joseph Hasker, the freight hauler, is a good man. He can be trusted. That night, the wind howled, rattling the new pane of glass in its frame. Unable to sleep, Alice lit her lamp, pulled the ledger from its hiding place, and found the book of verse Elias had mentioned, a thin volume of poetry tucked away on the shelf. Following his instructions, she began the painstaking work of decryption. A sequence like P14 L5W2 meant page 14, line 5, the second word. The first letter of that word was the decoded letter. It was slow, tedious work. After an hour, she had a single short sentence deciphered from Elias's own records. Croft buys parcel 7B. Survey confirms water rights. It was proof. Just then, she heard it. A faint rhythmic clicking from the corner of the room. It was impossibly quiet, almost inaudible beneath the wind. It wasn't coming from the main telegraph sounder. Her eyes followed the sound to a secondary wire nearly hidden in the shadows that ran down the wall and disappeared through a small hole in the floor. It was the hidden tap line. Elias was gone, but the swindlers were still using it. Working quickly, she found a spare sounder in a box of old equipment, and her hands, shaking slightly, connected it to the secret wire. The clicks became sharp, distinct. It was code. She began to write, her pencil flying across a blank message form, capturing the stream of letters and numbers. She worked for half an hour until the transmission stopped. Then she turned back to the ledger and the book of verse. It took her the rest of the night, her eyes gritty with exhaustion. But as the first pale light of dawn touched the prairie, she had the message decoded. It read, "Rail spur confirmed. Acquire Sector 4G. Use Hasker Freight for survey markers. Payment on delivery." As his name was right there, tied to the scheme. But Elias had trusted him. Was he a traitor, or was his name being used without his knowledge? There was only one way to find out. The next day, Alice saw Joseph Hask loading his wagon near the mercantile. She walked straight to him, her heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm against her ribs. She held out the decoded message. "This came over a wire in my office last night," she said, her voice low and even. He took the paper, his eyes scanning the words. His face, already a mask of hard-bitten caution, seemed to turn to stone. He looked from the paper to her, and for the first time, she saw the guard in his eyes drop away, replaced by a raw, dangerous anger. "They're using my roots," he said, his voice a greyly whisper. "My name. That son of a Crofted." He crumpled the paper in his fist. "I thought the line was dead. I thought Elias." He trailed off, the muscle in his jaw working. "I haven't heard from him in 6 months. I thought they'd caught him. I thought he was dead." He looked at Alice, truly seeing her now, not as a foolish girl, but as an unexpected and courageous variable in a deadly game. "Elias trusted you," Alice said quietly. "He wrote it in a letter he left behind. That was all it took." The last wall of his suspicion crumbled. From that moment on, they were partners. Joseph explained his role. Elias would give him coded messages, and he would carry them hidden in his freight shipments to Marshal Albright in Bismarck. His freight business gave him the perfect cover to travel without raising suspicion. Now, with Alice able to intercept Croft's messages in real time, they had a weapon Elias never did. They could anticipate Croft's moves. A new phase of work began, one of both construction and conspiracy. Joseph started showing up at the Telegraph office in the evenings. He never announced his arrival. He would just appear, bringing with him a load of good seasoned lumber in his wagon, or a box of iron fittings. I was a man who spoke with actions, not words. He saw her struggling to frame a new sturdy door, and took the hammer from her hand, not in condescension, but in shared purpose. "Let me show you," he said, and proceeded to demonstrate how to brace it so it would hang true for 100 years. As they worked, the community, which had kept its distance, began to take notice. The first to bridge the gap was Mr. Sorensen, an elderly Swedish carpenter with hands gnarled by a lifetime of woodworking. He had known and respected Mrs. Gable. He stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to inspect their work. He watched Joseph and Alice wrestling with a warped beam for the porch roof. He shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. "That wood has a bad memory," he said, his accent thick. "You must persuade it, not fight it." He went back to his workshop and returned with a set of specialized clamps and a block plane, and he spent the rest of the day showing them how to steam the wood and true the edge. He never asked for payment. "A straight roof keeps the heart warm," he said, packing his tools. His acceptance was a signal. A few days later, Mrs. Dunn, the baker's wife, appeared at the door with a steaming pot of beef stew and a fresh loaf of bread. "A body can't build a life on an empty stomach," she declared, bustling into the small living quarters and setting the meal on the table. She saw the sparse shelves, the single pot. From then on, a hot meal or a loaf of bread would appear on Alice's porch every other day. Then came Samuel, the blacksmith's apprentice, a young man of 17 with soot on his cheeks and an earnest curiosity in his eyes. He saw the broken hinge on the door and returned an hour later with a newly forged one, stronger than the original. He refused payment, saying only, "Joseph said, you were good people." Through these quiet, steady acts of practical generosity, the Telegraph office was being rebuilt, and so was Alice's place in the world. It was no longer the haunted shack on the edge of town. It was becoming a home built not just by her hands, but by the slow, cautious, and deeply felt acceptance of a community. The office, once a shell of neglect, began to breathe again. The roof was sound, the windows clear, the door hung straight and true on its new hinges. Inside, the small living space was warm and clean. The scent of fresh-cut pine from the new floorboards, mingling with the aroma of coffee from the stove. The main office was orderly, the operator's desk polished, the brass key gleaming. Alice had done more than just repair a building. She had reclaimed it. She and Joseph fell into a comfortable rhythm. By day, she would take on mending work or help at the mercantile, earning her keep and embedding herself in the town's daily life. People who had once stared at her with suspicion now greeted her by name. "Morning, Alice. That's a fine job you did on that roof, miss." By night, the office would become their command center. Alice would listen to the secret wire, her pencil poised, while Joseph would sit by the stove cleaning a piece of harness or planning his next freight run. The coded messages from Croft's network continued, and Alice's skill at decryption grew. They were now able to piece together the full scope of the swindle, mapping out the parcels of land Croft was targeting. They used the information strategically. Joseph would carry a message to Marshal Albright with the authentic intelligence, while Alice, using her own growing knowledge of the code, would occasionally send a false transmission back on the tap line. A subtle misdirection to send Croft's agents on a fool's errand, buying time. The office transformed from a place of fear into a hub of quiet rebellion. It was no longer haunted by the ghost of Elias Vance. It was animated by his purpose. Alice felt a profound connection to the man, a sense of finishing the work he had so bravely started. One day, a message came over the main public wire, the first since she had taken ownership. It was from the railroad superintendent, inquiring about the status of the redemption office. With trembling fingers, Alice connected the primary battery jars she had painstakingly cleaned and refilled. She tapped out a reply. Redemption office operational. Alice Whitaker, operator, awaiting instructions. The response came back almost immediately, a stream of clicks that filled the room with life. They authorized her as the acting agent, promising official paperwork and a salary. She was no longer just a squatter. She was the town's telegraph operator. The final act of the drama unfolded not with a bang, but with the quiet authority of the law. Marshal Albright, armed with 6 months of evidence from Elias and the real-time intelligence from Alice and Joseph, arrived in town with 2 deputies. He didn't ride in with guns blazing. He walked into the Redemption Bank on a Tuesday morning, presented Silas Croft with a warrant for his arrest on charges of mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy against the United States government. Croft, a man whose power had seemed absolute, simply deflated. Faced with the irrefutable proof in Elias's ledger and the corroborating messages Alice had intercepted, he surrendered without a word. The town was stunned, but the truth, once revealed, was undeniable. The lands were restored to the public domain, and a new land office agent was appointed to ensure fair claims. The telegraph office, once a symbol of a dark secret, was now the celebrated source of the town's deliverance. It became the true heart of redemption, a place of connection and news. Alice sat at her desk, her hand on the key, sending and receiving the ordinary messages of life. A merchant ordering supplies, a husband telling his wife he'd be home late, a son announcing the birth of a child. She was the vital link, the steady pulse of the community. The clicking of the sounder was no longer a ghostly whisper. It was the sound of her own life, humming with purpose. A deep winter snow had fallen, blanketing the prairie in a profound and peaceful silence. Inside the telegraph office, a fire crackled in the small stove, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. Alice sat at the operator's desk, the wires quiet for the night. She looked around the small space that was now her entire world. She saw the sturdy ceiling joists placed with the guidance of Mr. Sorensen's knowing hands. She saw the clean, bright window pane that held back the Dakota wind, a testament to her own patient labor. The door, solid and secure on its hand-forged hinges from Samuel, was a symbol of the safety she had built for herself. This room was a map of her journey, each repair a landmark of her resilience, each contribution a mark of her acceptance. She was no longer a shadow in someone else's house. She was the master of her own. She reached into a small wooden box where she kept her few personal treasures and took out the maple songbird her father had carved so many years ago. Its surface was worn smooth from a lifetime of being held in moments of fear and uncertainty. She placed it on the desk. Then she opened a drawer and took out another object, a small, heavy brass weight from the internal mechanism of Elias Vance's original telegraph sounder. She had kept it when she installed the new equipment the railroad had sent. It was a solid, tangible piece of his legacy, a reminder of the quiet courage of a stranger who had trusted the future. She set the brass weight on the desk beside the wooden bird. The two objects sat together in the lamplight. One, a symbol of the unconditional love she had lost. The other a symbol of the principled integrity she had found. They were from two different men, from two different lives. Both lost too soon, but their legacies of love and courage now shared the same small circle of light on her desk. The door opened, letting in a swirl of cold air and snow. It was Joseph. He carried an armload of firewood, which he stacked neatly in the corner. He didn't speak of the past, of Croft, or of the danger they had faced. He simply moved with a quiet, familiar grace, his presence a comforting warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He brushed the snow from his shoulders and came to stand behind her, his hand resting gently on the back of her chair. "Why's quiet tonight?" he said. It wasn't a question, but a shared observation of the peace they had earned. "Yes," Alice replied, her gaze still on the two objects on her desk. "It's quiet." It was all that needed to be said. The narrative of her life had been rewritten. The teachings of Mrs. Gable had given her the competence to survive. Her father's gift had reminded her of the goodness she came from. And Elias Vance's desperate hope, left buried under a floorboard, had given her a purpose. She was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had built. Alice Whitaker was 25 and had been cast out with $3 to her name. She spent it all on an abandoned telegraph office nobody wanted. It was the best $3 she ever spent. Thank you for joining us for tonight's story. We hope it brought a little warmth and light to your evening. If you enjoyed it, please consider sharing it with someone who appreciates a story of quiet strength and hidden courage. And before you go, we'd like to leave you with a question to carry with you. What forgotten place or overlooked thing in your own life might be holding an unexpected story, just waiting for someone to listen? From all of us here, be well and good night.